Hello and welcome to Pattern Paper Play. I'm Victoria Calvin, your course instructor, and I am so thrilled that you are taking this class all about pattern paper design. I've got 6 fantastic techniques to teach you, and I hope that after this class you will be inspired to use your pattern paper in an interesting way. Like most paper crafters, I absolutely adore pattern paper, and over the years I have learned a lot of techniques to maximize my pattern paper and to create fantastic layouts using pattern paper as a focal point or a layering element. And we're going to talk about all of that in this class. So be sure to grab your PDF guide for this lesson and let's get started. We're going to start the class out with lesson 1, focal point. In this lesson, we're going to explore how to isolate a focal point on a pattern paper to create an interesting scrapbook layout composition. But first, what exactly do I mean by focal point? A focal point is the most important part or parts of a layout design. It draws the viewer's eye into a composition, directing the viewer to the compelling parts of a layout. There are many parts of a pattern paper design that can be isolated to create a focal point, and that's what we're going to explore in this lesson. Of course, this is a really great opportunity for you to use pattern paper in a different way that maybe you haven't thought about before. So in this lesson, I'm going to show you 2 really fun ways in which you can create a focal point on pattern paper. To begin, the materials I'm using for our first layout as well as our bonus layout is this collection from Simple Stories. It's called My Story. I'm first showing you the embellishments that I'm going to use, some of the die cuts and puffy stickers, as well as the flat back brads and a few cardstock die cuts. For my pattern paper options, I have the 12 by 12 inch pattern paper that's in the collection, as well as the 6 by 8 paper pad, which is fantastic because it features a smaller version of the prints that can often be used for a lot of pattern paper techniques, including establishing a focal point. But for the project that I'm going to work on first, we're going to focus on 12 by 12 inch pattern paper. So here's an example of one of the papers that I'm going to use. I'm going to use that actually in our bonus project coming up here in just a few. Notice that there's some tags there, and I have an inclination to cut those every time that I see a pattern paper like that, but we're going to do something slightly different. This pattern paper is super cute, but it's also very busy. I decided to use this as an example of establishing a focal point because normally we would probably shy away from a pattern paper like this, but there's a way that you can use it to where it looks really, really good on your layout. There's other patterns here that I can choose from. I'm also, along with the more busier pattern paper, the pattern paper I'm going to use for my focal point, I want to pair that with a pattern that's a little bit more subtle to add some juxtaposition to the pattern paper. So let's go ahead and get straight into the project. So here's this pattern paper, and what I want to do is I don't want to use all of it because it's just a little bit too busy. So I'm going to cut this in half. So I'm going to use one part of this that's 6 by 12 inches, and I'm going to pair it with this black and white grid paper. And the reason why I'm doing this is if I'm using the right side to establish a focal point, I need another part of the layout where the eye can rest, where the pattern's not as busy. Now this pattern features, like, it looks like a little city scene with a bookshop and a coffee shop and a bakery and that type of thing, and it's really cute and it goes well with the theme of my layout, which I'll share here in a second. I'm going to create a natural divide there by using just another piece of pattern paper. This is a tone-on-tone, smaller grid design pattern paper that I just cut a 1-inch strip, or maybe a 1/2 inch strip by 12 inches, and I'm going to cover the joint between the black and white grid and the pattern paper. So at this point, I'm already isolating that really beautiful illustrated pattern paper on the right hand side, but also giving my eye a place to rest. So don't feel like you have to use an entire pattern paper with a compelling design in its entirety. You can cut it down into sections and use it as a focal point. I'm going to bring in my photos. I'm using 2 4 by 6 inch photos and 1 2 by 3 inch photo. And this is of me doing work at a coffee shop. My family and I were on vacation in Austin this summer, and I had to do just a tiny bit of work. So I thought that the pattern paper on the right would speak to me being out and about at a coffee shop doing some work. I also wanted to make sure that my photo placement still allowed me to have those elements showing that really fed into the storytelling experience. I'm not covering up the pattern paper in its entirety, but I'm leaving just a little out so that it can be highlighted in the composition. Because I isolated that part of the layout, made it a little bit smaller, it allows the eye to focus a lot more on those background elements on the pattern paper that I want to highlight. I also used a smaller photo at the bottom, which is a photo of the coffee drink I was drinking, just to kind of emphasize the fact that I was at a coffee shop. But notice that it doesn't cover up that bottom element of the pattern paper. So I have it isolated to the right-hand side, trim that pattern paper so it's something that was a little bit more workable for me. But when you take in the composition, your eye goes from the right side of the layout, taking in not only photos, but those focal point elements there on the right, but then it can rest with that black and white grid paper. Now I want to go ahead and finish up this layout. So I'm going to add this foam sticker that says My Story, and that's going to go on the left-hand side. Another reason why I chose to go with a more subtle print, one, so it doesn't take away from my focal point on the right-hand side, but also two, my title shows up. Whereas if I put that title where the busier pattern paper was, it would probably just kind of fall in the background, and then my pattern paper wouldn't be sort of the highlight of the show. I have a journaling box that's going to go to the left-hand side that basically talks about using that time to get some things in order for whatever it is I was working on at that time. I also pulled in some fun embellishments from the collection. I'm going to create some clusters. Now here's where things can get slightly tricky whenever you are creating a focal point. One of the things is depending on your focal point, you don't want to take too much away from it. And with pattern paper, particularly with a pattern paper like the one on the right-hand side of the little cityscape, if you add too many embellishments, it can clash with that focal point. So I'm just going to add a small amount there. I have, of course, an embellishment on the left-hand side and one under the title, but I'm going to establish a cluster on the right-hand side. Again, not to take away from the focal point of the pattern paper, but just kind of elevate the design and add some balance and continuity. So I have some various elements of sizes, shapes, scale, some florals, some butterflies, and I'm just popping up there on the layout at the top left of the photo and then at the bottom of the title. I'm going to go ahead and add this die cut and create a cluster there at the corner of the photo, and notice that I'm very intentional on where I place that because, again, my focal point is those little buildings there at the top right and at the bottom right of that particular pattern paper. So I don't want anything covering that up. When the eye takes in that cluster, not only is it taking in the layered cluster part, the aspects of that, the die cut and the camera, but it's also taking in that pattern paper there in the back. It's highlighting that pattern paper. I'm going to add a few more embellishments. Of course, I was at a coffee shop, so I have to add some coffee cups to these layers. Again, not taking away from it, but adding to it and really highlighting that pattern paper. I'm going to repeat this on the other clusters of the layout, the one at the top and the one at the bottom, using some foam stickers from the collection. And once I have that in place, I can add the finishing details, which are going to be some label stickers as well as some flat back brads. Now, a couple of things I want you to consider when you're establishing a focal point. One, you want to make sure that whatever area you want to emphasize is shown on your layout. So be mindful and strategic as to where you position the different elements on your layout. So for example, I just wanted a small cluster there at the top, but I wanted to make sure that the remaining of that pattern paper, the areas that I wanted to be the focal point, were still visible. And two, again, you don't have to use a particular pattern paper in its entirety. You can cut it up diagonally, vertically, horizontally. You can cut a chunk of it out, add it to your background, and create a focal point around that. So here we have our finished project, and I love the way that this looks because, again, those beautiful illustrations on the pattern paper on the right-hand side are visible and in keeping with the theme of the layout. And because I established this focal point on the right-hand side, supported by all the elements there on the page, the eye is drawn from the right-hand side of the layout to the left. So you're taking in all that beautiful illustrated goodness on the right-hand side, but then your eye can rest on the left-hand side. So those partner very well to provide some visual balance and weight to this composition. Now let's go on to our bonus layout project. I want to challenge your skills a little bit. So here I have this pattern paper that features tags, and my first inclination whenever I see a pattern paper like this is to cut those tags and use them in a functional way separately, like as an embellishment on a layout. But what we're going to do is we're going to use this pattern paper to our advantage. There are different size blocks here of the tags, and I figured when I was designing this layout, I could use those spaces to add photos and journaling and create some focal point spaces on this layout. So we're going to create a 12 by 12 inch layout, and right now I'm just measuring these spaces to get an idea of what size I want my photos to be. And ultimately I printed out photos, 3 photos that are 3 by 4 inches. Now I'm going to document some photos of my daughter who recently earned pointe shoes. She is a ballerina and she is now doing pointe training. So I'm going to create this layout to document that experience. I also made sure that I printed out some journaling. So again, measured those boxes where the tags are, and I sized text box in Microsoft Word accordingly, typed my journaling, and I printed on vellum from Hero Arts. You could also just handwrite your journaling if you like in some of these open spaces. Now, this particular layout works well for a design like this, or perhaps if you have a 12 by 12 inch pattern paper, or really any size that maybe features a pocket card. We have a lot of those that are featured in collections. You can do the same thing. So I'm creating a focal point in 3 parts of the layout. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a really fun storytelling journey, taking the viewer on a journey from the top part of the layout where I start my story to the bottom left to the right side. What I want to do is scale this pattern paper down just a little bit because I don't want to use it in its entirety. I just want to isolate the areas that I'm going to amplify with my photos and my journaling and embellishing. So I took some pattern paper from the collection. So I love this pattern paper. The design kind of looks a little bit weird, but those are actually butterflies. And to add a point of delineation, I'm going to use this tone-on-tone blue grid pattern paper. And then I'm going to bring in the tag pattern paper. So I'm creating 3 levels of gorgeous pattern paper all layered up. This allows me, again, to really concentrate the elements on this focal point pattern paper and the various areas that I want to highlight and amplify. Now, this is another good reminder that you can cut up and trim up these papers, even if it's going to be your focal point, to something that's going to be a little bit more pleasing to your eye. And for this particular pattern paper, because it did have tags going from edge to edge of the pattern paper, it was great to be able to trim it up and scale it down a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and add in my photos, creating 3 distinct areas as my focal point. So I have a photo there at the top, one at the bottom left, and one to the side right, along with the corresponding journaling boxes. That way the viewer's eye is going to go from the first focal point to the second one to the left-hand side, and then finishing up here with the photo on the right. There are some tags that are going to be covered up, and that's perfectly okay. And you may have more or less covered up if you decide to duplicate this project, depending on the style of pattern paper that you're using and the size of photos. It might be a little bit different, but you get the gist here. I'm going to go ahead and place all of the journaling boxes down. And at this point, I'm making some decisions on how I want to embellish. And again, I'm keeping mindful of the fact that I have 3 focal points, using the tags as a supporting focal point along with my photos and my journaling, so I don't want to cover up things too much. I do want to go ahead and place my title, and that's going to go right there in the middle, and it says Happy Day. This is a foam sticker from the Simple Stories My Story collection. And then I have 3 distinct areas where I can amplify the focal points a little bit with some embellishing. So I have some die cuts that I'm going to place around the layout. The first one's going to go to the top by the photo, but again, not covering up that tag because that's part of the focal point. I want to make sure that that stays visible. I'm going to do the same thing for the photo at the bottom right, not covering up the tag, keeping it visible. And then here to the one on the left. And notice that the size of my elements are scaled down just a little bit because I don't want it to be super overwhelming. I still want the eye to be able to see the tags. So I'm positioning this foam camera to take up a little bit of the white space down there, but still leaving the tag visible. And then at the top, there's a tiny bit of white space in the photo. So I'm going to place a little foam butterfly there to help finish out that particular focal point. And then another one here at the bottom, which is just simply a flower. I also want to add in some finishing touches. So I'm going to grab these label stickers. This says documented, and that's going to play right there with my top focal point, but also serve double duty as a part of my title. I have another sticker here that I'm going to shop around for just a little bit. It says, "This is me." And I'm putting that there because I want the eye drawn to that top focal point. And then another sticker that says, "Dream Big." I have a couple more label stickers. This one says, "So Happy." Another one says, "Shine." And then the very last one says goals. And this helps the eye to go from one focal point to the next to the next. And once those elements are in place, this bonus project is done. Normally, again, I would have cut up this pattern paper, but instead I chose to use it as a compelling background and to establish focal points throughout the layout that will take the viewer's eye on a storytelling journey. This is a really practical way and a very fun stylistic way to use a pattern paper like this. So let's review the concepts that we covered so far in this lesson. First, when you're establishing a focal point, you want to find the most compelling part of your pattern paper. And remember, you do not have to use the paper in its entirety. You can trim it down and cut it up to establish a really fun design and to make sure that the eye is drawn to the area of the pattern paper that you've established as your focal point. Also, be sure to use elements that help amplify the focal point of your layout. So for example, I created just a small cluster there at the top right of this layout, but it draws the eye to the illustration there at the top. But also on the side of the layout, it doesn't take away from the fact that there is other elements at the bottom right of the layout either. So you don't want something that's going to be too overwhelming that'll take over your focal point. Another thing is to consider using pattern paper in a different way to establish a focal point. So for example, this particular pattern paper featured tags, but instead of cutting up those tags, I used them as 3 main focal points on my layout. Each area is emphasized by a photo, journaling, and embellishment clusters that take you on a really fun storytelling journey as a viewer. So instead of passing up a pattern paper like this or cutting it up to use as embellishments on a layout, think about how you can use the pattern paper to establish focal points for your layout composition. Now it's your turn. Reach into your stash and grab some beautiful pattern paper. Take a look at the designs and decide what part of the pattern paper can you use to create a focal point. There are lots of fantastic options, from sunbursts to stripes to florals to scenes, characters. See what pattern paper will work for your story and create a focal point as the basis of your scrapbook design. Next up, we're going to be designing with pattern paper strips. So when you're ready, click on the next lesson to continue.